Welcome to Season 6 of the ReidConnect-Ed podcast.
Wow, Season 6 already. We're so excited to be here.
Yeah, it's been a long road, and the vision of this podcast has come to fruition. We're in the 6th season now, and we hope that people are really benefiting from the information we're trying to get out there as a free resource on topics like mental health, education, learning, executive function, and sport and performance psychology.
So many aspects of life. And today we're joined in the studio by Raphael the Vishla, who hopefully is okay over there. Our producer, Rob, is taking good care of him, but hopefully you can feel the love that he exudes anytime he comes around.
In this episode, Alexis and I, we're going to dive into talking about the idea of facing one's fears as a common factor that makes all different therapies beneficial. So meaning that it is actually helpful for mental health, regardless of the type of therapy that you're using. In the field of psychotherapy, there's a lot of different types of philosophies, strategies, concepts that are built into different types of therapies. There's cognitive behavioral therapy, there's psychodynamic therapy, interpersonal therapy, exposure therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance to commitment therapy. There's so many, the list goes on and on and on. And so some people in the field, including those at the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders at Boston University, such as David Barlow, among others, such as Dr. Bruce Wampold, have spent the last several decades trying to look at these common factors that cut across all different therapies, meaning that regardless of the type of therapy you're using, there's something underlying all of these therapies that make therapy beneficial to people. Because at the end of the day, we can't truly say this is exactly why and how therapy is helpful to a particular individual. We have hypotheses, we have theories. And so people like Dr. Barlow and Dr. Wampold have really tried to look at these common factors that regardless of the therapy you're using, what makes them beneficial. Because at the end of the day, both of these specific factors in terms of what therapy you're using could be useful, and also these common factors are also useful. And so today we're going to focus specifically on the idea that facing one's fears, and the term for this is exposure therapy, right, is in fact something that cuts across all different therapies. I'm going to make an argument, and many people have made this argument, that, facing one's fears is essentially what happens in a lot of different therapies, regardless of what you're working on, because, avoidance of things, avoidance of talking about experiences, avoidance of confronting challenges in life, avoidance of literally anything is in some ways considered what maintains or even influences mental health challenges in the first place. So we're going to talk about how exposure therapy, right, facing one's fears, is an essential part of all different types of therapies, regardless of what type of therapy you're in. And I'll try to, give some examples and talk about some real life examples of what this looks like and how it might apply to a person's life, right, whether you're in therapy or not.
So even though this is your bread and butter, right, this is really the focus of a lot of your training as well as your professional career and the way in which you train the therapists in training that you work with at Boston University in your professor role. Mm-hmm. This also plays a role in the work I do. Even though I'm not a clinical psychologist, I'm constantly exposing the people I work with to things that sometimes they've been avoiding or that might stress them out or that might feel uncomfortable. So as we go through this conversation, you'll hear a lot of different examples of how this might play out, some of the conceptualization that you and I both, from a research theoretical perspective, have learned about why this is influential and helpful for people in their journeys, but also through anecdotes of our careers. Both myself in the classroom and in private practice, as well as working with adult learners when I'm training educators or people working in a field. But all of it is about, basically what we talk about here on the podcast. Can we be curious? Can we be open? Can we be well? Because that brings it all together and allows for us to face our fears, face the things that might be challenging us. And, fear, like trauma, I would say, is like capital F, lowercase f. There might be things that are really fearful, that we're really frightened by and stifled, where we stop in our tracks. And like maybe other aspects of life that might be more of like a lowercase f in fear, where, we can tread lightly and kind of just get outside of our comfort zone. And I think this is the way we're conceptualizing things today. It's going to be a really cool conversation, and we're looking forward to you joining us.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. Excited for this conversation.
So, Jer, I vividly have this picture in my mind when you completed your doctorate, right? And I don't know if I was more excited or you were for you completing your doctorate and getting your degree, because I was just so proud of the way in which you approached everything you did. Jerry dove so deeply into everything, and I'm pretty sure you have countless notebooks and Word documents outlining every book you've ever read, most articles you've ever read, every lecture you've been to. Because not only did you want to absorb the information you were exposed to and really make the most out of this opportunity, which, is an incredible privilege and opportunity to even step foot into a doctoral program, especially at BU and working at CARD through your training there and other places too that we'll talk about. But you wanted to be able to absorb all of the information and make sense of it through the practice and the work that you were doing to really honor your patient and clients' experiences, I think, more than anything. So, maybe we'll use this picture of when you finished your degree, and I have a sign that says, "What's up, doc?" Because I was so proud of you. And it wasn't just about the degree and the title, because you and I really aren't into that stuff. It was more about the journey and the culmination of this next phase of your life. And it was so cool. And, I know how much you sacrificed to get here. And you continue to take every day of your work through that same lens of how can I best honor the people I work with to better help them. So when we go through this conversation, this is not superficial at all. And of course, like anything, there's going to be different perspectives to what we talk about here today that other people can probably add into the conversation, no doubt. So, I want everybody out there to understand that we're going to be talking about this in a very deep way because it's what we think about all the time. And not just in our professional careers, but also personally, I think, we try to be and show up as the best versions of ourselves. And we do that through learning through our own experiences and also the experiences of others. So here we go. Jared, tell me a little bit about, from your perspective, your experience in being a doctoral student at BU and studying through some of the world-renowned masters at CARD and all the influences you've had to get here to bring it all together.
Yeah, well, I appreciate everything you said. And shows how much we care about each other, that you can pick up on the nuances of my life experience. So I appreciate it. And funny enough, literally this week, I jumped on a virtual call with someone, and the kid jumps on the call, and he goes, first thing he says, "What's up, doc?"
No way. Yeah, so, not planned at all. I had no idea.
No, see, synchronicity there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I did my doctoral program in counseling psychology at BU, and the clinical psychology program at BU is where Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders is housed. And just an incredible training program. So started by Dr. David Barlow. And I mentioned him, right, because he is one of the pioneers in the field that have tried to say how a lot of the different types of things we're doing with all these therapies, we need to help the field do better with training, right? Because there's so many therapies out there. You can go through a whole list of all these different therapy manuals and therapy approaches and skills and techniques and strategies. And, he's basically suggesting that it's too much for a clinician to learn everything. Mm. And also, is it even necessary to know all these different types of therapies? Or, as we were saying before, are there commonalities between them that we can just focus on and say, hey, this is the most important core elements of what makes therapy helpful? Again, we also have the humility to not truly know what makes therapy helpful for especially for each individual who's different, right? And in many ways, psychodynamic therapy is in some ways like this, right? That there's kind of commonalities among human beings. And psychodynamic therapy is actually, I would say, the first type of therapy that really try to look at common factors, right? And so at CARD, my training, I was there for several years, there was a heavy emphasis on the fact that avoidance maintains mental health problems. Mm. So you can think of avoidance in any type of way. We avoid conflict. We avoid addressing the problems in our life. We avoid we avoid thinking about things. We avoid in the most subtle and overt ways, any type of avoidance, right? Sometimes avoidance is healthy and necessary to survive, but there's that healthy balance of too much avoidance can maintain our problems because we never actually confront the things that we're afraid of. And the idea is that when you confront something you're afraid of, you learn through experience. You learn through experience what is more in terms of what's reality. So as a classic example, right, someone's afraid to go on the bus. They have a fear of being on a public transportation, right? And who knows where that fear came from. Maybe something bad had happened, or maybe they just have an imagination that imagines horrible things happening, right? And so if you really want to get over that fear, the idea of exposure therapy is gradually help you to do the very thing you're afraid of. And you learn through experience, is the thing that you're afraid of, does it actually happen? And number two, if something bad does happen, can you still cope and live through it? Can you use your resources to find comfort, to find support, to learn from that experience for next time? So there's really two questions that exposure therapy answers. I just want to set the stage for this episode. The first question is what you were afraid of, did it really happen the way you expected it to? Because we're always imagining, projecting, assuming things about life, about other people that may not be completely accurate. So the exposure helps us to test those assumptions, right, in real time. And then the second question that exposure therapy answers is, even if something unpleasant happens, like let's say you confront someone and then things get kind of messy, right, which is like, oh my God, I don't want things to get messy, right? People say that a lot. I'm afraid to speak up. I'm afraid things will get worse. Even if that does happen through the exposure, can you still live through it? Can you still use that as an opportunity to learn from it and to grow from it? And also to comfort yourself and to use your resources, like I said, to find comfort, because life is going to come with those unpleasant experiences that we need to learn how to soothe ourselves and get comfort.
I talk to students all the time because I often coach them through, thinking about different pathways when we're trying to build cognitive flexibility from an executive function perspective. And a lot of, just yesterday, a college student said, what happens if I try this thing and it's, the worst case scenario? I end up having an experience like I had before that just really was terrible. And I said, well, what happens if it's the opposite? What happens if it becomes your most memorable experience? What happens if it becomes something that is positive and makes you feel good? So it's so interesting how we can construct these mental images and scenarios in our minds that may or may not exist, may or may not even play out the way in which we're conceptualizing them.
Yeah, it's so true. And I mean, we're a predictive species, right? We want to predict because it's protective, right? You asked me in an earlier episode, why do we always think about the negative things that happen in our life? In some ways, we're using all this potentially quote unquote negative information to protect ourselves from something bad happening. We're a protective species. We're vulnerable. So we're always looking to protect ourselves. That's why we're always, trying to project the future.
Yeah. And I imagine too, from like a neuro-developmental perspective too, that if we're constantly replaying the thing that went wrong in our head, we're strengthening those neural connections, right? So that makes that memory stronger in our minds, which inevitably, and you could take it from here, reinforces the fear of this is going to happen again, or this could happen, instead of thinking about the alternative option. And again, going back to executive functions, because that's, my specialty is, a lot of young people, when they don't have experiences, we've said this on the podcast many times before, and there are not enough data points. We only know what we know. It's hard for us to see different paths, different outcomes that maybe aren't as bad as we can dream up in our minds and think of the worst case scenarios.
Absolutely. And it's a self-reinforcing cycle, right? The more you avoid something, the less you trust yourself, the less you trust that you can do something, right?
Well, I'll give you a scenario. I feel like I'm doing mini exposures every day when Raphael is in Boston with me, because he's not quite a city dog. He grew up and spends a lot of time on Cape Cod with mom and with us. And I feel like every single day I'm coaching him through a new exposure. Right now, he's just a room next to us, but he's really nervous that he's not right by my side. Even though he's in very good hands and doing okay, it's an exposure, right? It's a little bit uncomfortable for me and definitely for him, but we're working through it.
Yeah. And this is a good example why exposure is helpful if you do it in a thoughtful way. So like sometimes, like I said, sometimes you try something and you kind of have to live a life like trial and error and see what works and doesn't work. And so exposure therapy is not just putting people in a situation that makes them extremely uncomfortable and just like making that the status quo. So part of exposure therapy is actually trying to realize through the experience how to troubleshoot, how to make adjustments in life. You know, because like as a parent, right, for example, with a child, you don't want to just kind of like force them into a situation where they're just like crippled with anxiety the whole time, because that's not fair to the child. It's also not teaching them anything. They're just they're just surviving it, right? Like we call it white knuckling, where the child is just like squeezing their fists together, just surviving it, but they're not experiencing anything. They're just getting through it. And so, you know, part of exposure therapy is to try to see what is reasonable for the person. And I think a misconception of exposure therapy is just kind of force people to doing things they don't want to do and expecting that things will get better, because, you know, that's also why a lot of therapists don't use exposure therapy. They feel like it's unfair. They feel like it's unethical, or they feel like it's not humane, right? But the reality of if you're really doing exposure therapy, that's not the way you're doing it. First of all, you never force a child or a person or a patient to do an exposure they don't want to do, that they're not willing to do. So it's a really important point to make about, you know, the public understanding exposure therapy, that there's always consent involved, right? The child, the patient, whoever's involved in the therapy understands why we would do it and also is willing to try it through their own volition.
You know, I want you to kind of unpack that a little bit more. I know you don't love that word, but I also want to point out that if we continue along the same paths that we do, there's often a comfort there, which makes it feel safe to just do what we do in our day-to-day. But sometimes when we reinforce behaviors in that comfort zone, it might limit us. So there's two sides, and I talk about and think about this a lot. I probably think about this more than I talk about, but sometimes it's okay to kind of just be where you are, to be in a comfortable space. I think that we're in a society now that everybody thinks that we need to constantly push to do better and be better.
Yeah.
You know, we're inundated by social media saying you need to do this and that, and
Be
you have to,
superhuman.
yeah, you have to be the best version of yourself. And no doubt, I want people to be able to live their purpose and feel their agency and empower them. But sometimes it's okay just to be as well. So I want to, you know, also broach this whole conversation in thinking about sometimes we're okay where we are. And when our journey and our life path gets to a point where maybe there's a new chapter, there's a new change, a new transition, this is where exposure therapy can be really helpful, right? The things that are uncomfortable and notice how it impacts your life, how it impacts where you are. And then you get to decide, like you say, you know, you get to decide what you want to work on, where you want to go. And this is where I think exposure therapy, or just, you know, taking small steps, baby steps, little exposures yourself, can be helpful.
Yeah, and there's definitely a connection to the idea of the beginner's mind, which, you know, comes from Buddhism and mindful meditation, right? The idea that you're trying to be open to just what is, rather than trying to project what you think is going on or what you're assuming. And so exposure therapy in some ways is just kind of, you know, seeing what's really going on and responding accordingly, you know, in a natural way, right? You're not trying to force something. You're not trying to make something what it isn't. You're trying to work with what is, right? So as you're saying, you try to do something and you get out of your comfort zone, you kind of test the waters. And then, you know, it's important to not get stuck in like, oh, like this is how it has to happen. This is how it has to go. You'll see that a lot with your students, right? With perfectionism, right? Okay, I tried something, but it didn't go exactly how I wanted it to. And so if you're going to do exposure and try something new and you have this expectation that it's got to go a perfect way, that's also not the best way to do exposure, right? Because, you know, you're going in with these preconceived notions of how things should go, how they're supposed to go. In a lot of ways, exposure therapy, this is how it's a common factor across therapies, is you expose yourself to not doing that. You expose yourself to being open to what's happening And actually, that's how you really do better with problem solving in life, because the ideas sometimes just come to you when you're not forcing it. You know, the best, I don't want to say the best idea, but the idea that makes the most sense or that's most natural, that's going to help your life kind of flow naturally, and kind of things will grow and evolve, you know, more naturally. Sometimes those ideas come when you're not forcing it. You just kind of, you're open to what is. You know, as I said, a lot of times, John Wooden once said, you know, what's right is more important than who's right. You want to try to be open to that. And I think, you know, with you and Mom, I try my best to be open to your ideas, because I've learned over the years that, you know, sometimes I don't have all the perspective on something. And that's actually like good to be humble about that. And to realize that they may have an insight that really helps me to like make a small adjustment, and it just completely opens up the whole roadway. And I got I can hit the gas and go forward, because things open up for me, right?
Mom calls it take the bull by the horns.
Take the bull by the horns, right? But sometimes you guys have really great ideas, and I really respect both of you about that. You have really good ideas that, because you have different perspectives. And so for me, exposure therapy is, and this goes for literally everyone, because I think most people have a hard time being open-minded, right? Because we all want to be right. We all want to not admit that we don't know something. And this is why all therapy is exposure therapy, is to be open. When you're open in therapy, that's when, you know, the growth happens. And to be able to expose yourself to being open, not feeling like you need to know everything.
So we didn't plan this, but I'm going to have you walk through what you would do for me in a situation I just experienced. Okay? So when I'm working with teachers and parents alike, there's this thing I like to share with them. It's kind of an exercise activity, but it's like you observe a behavior that you notice is maybe not working out well for the student you're working with, for your child, for somebody in your relationship to. It doesn't matter what age you are. But you observe something that maybe is maladaptive, not working, right? And I don't use maladaptive when I'm talking to clients. I'll say, you know what, is this not helpful for you? It seems like this pattern is not helpful. So we observe, and then we validate. The next phase is to narrate. Like, I noticed that you were seeming kind of worried when you started that project, when you were going to talk to somebody new, whatever the case might be. To narrate and kind of give the person who's experiencing a challenge a little bit of perspective of what was observed with no judgment, simply narrating the situation. And then the next phase is to evaluate. And if they're open to it, right? Like, hey, can we evaluate what else is possible? Can we think about and maybe problem solve together? Or maybe just in that process, the individual who is challenged sometimes sees things more clearly and can put the pieces together and know what to do on their own. That's the ultimate goal, that we're not telling people what to do, but that they can actually find that clarity, that openness to see what else is possible in their own experience. So here's my example. Ready? We went skiing recently with a bunch of friends, and you all are much better skiers than I am. And I recognize that, you know, quote unquote, I can ski. I've skied before. I've skied some pretty tough trails, and I held my own. I did okay. But I realized that I haven't skied in a while. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe I should take a lesson today. And I had to take that beginner's mindset. I had to say, you know, even to the instructor, I said, pretend I've never skied before. What would you tell me? How would you coach me? Because in my mind, I was giving myself an exposure, right? Like, usually I'm like, I could do this. I can hang because I have skills enough to compensate and get by, which is the majority of the people who are facing their fears or wondering if they should face their fears. We can compensate. We can get by enough. People who have like a baseline of skills that are pretty competent can do a lot of things. Doesn't mean we're facing our fears all the time.
This is a great example. And I think this is the nuance of why therapy is helpful. In your example, the exposure, people might say, oh, the exposure therapy for you is go on the blue, go on the diamond, go on the black diamond, right? Do the harder trail and push yourself.
Yeah.
That's the assumption of what their exposure therapy is.
Because I've done it before, why not do it again?
Right. Like, don't be so scared. You know, people always just do it. Don't be a baby, right? Don't do it, right? But the nuance here is that actually the exposure therapy for you, and for a lot of us, is actually to be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
And the vulnerability is I don't need to prove that I can do something or push myself beyond my limits. I can actually be okay just kind of, getting back to the basics because that's what I need right now versus what I want to, quote unquote, prove or something, right? Because what would you have gotten out of doing the much harder trail? Like, I mean, maybe you had some sense of accomplishment, right? But there's also a risk that you could have got hurt or injured or something like that, or just white-knuckled it down the hill and didn't enjoy it.
Well, here's an important piece because I think this is prevalent across a lot of people's lives in different situations.
Mm-hmm.
There would have been a sense of community that I was white knuckling it to be with the group.
Totally.
Right? To hang, to be able to like be a part of what everybody else was doing.
Exactly.
Even though I didn't feel comfortable.
Yeah.
I maybe wasn't confident in my skills, which could have made me vulnerable to hurting myself.
Yeah.
Right? And I weighed all those options. And I was like, what do I actually need in this situation? And this is, I'm mentioning it not only because I think it's a good example to talk through exposure. And I want you to actually tell me what you would do if you were, building me up to that moment.
Yeah.
But also because this is a big deal for me to be like that humble in this setting where I, one, have done this before and I was okay.
Mm-hmm.
And two, really choosing what I needed for myself instead of what other people wanted me to do or what could have been a social experience that I appreciate so much.
Yeah. I mean, the exposure is having boundaries for yourself, right? And I know your personality is you want to push the limit. You want to try everything. You want to, explore and do everything, right? That's part of your personality. And we all have, that's not a bad thing. That's what, that's why I admire you so much, right? But we also have to balance ourselves. And so for the exposure, it's to accept limits, right? And to be okay with that and to sit with, oh man, my impulse is telling me I want to do this, right? That's why, people who have impulsivity issues, it's like, actually, maybe the intervention is to do exposure to realizing why they want that so much and to say, wait, let me try to not do that and see if it's actually okay. How can I value what I have versus what I feel like I want or desire, right?
It's the majority of the work I do with the clients I work with who are very impulsive.
Yeah. And it's also, an exposure to gradually getting better at something, which, as you said, a lot of society has a hard time taking step by step to getting somewhere. Because the context for you is you really haven't skied a lot over the past 2 decades, right? You skied a bit, but like what you needed was just more foundation to build up to it. It doesn't mean that, like, I wouldn't say to you, don't ever do a blue or black diamond skiing wise, right? Don't do I would never say never get there and always feel left out, but get there at your own pace and feel good about yourself. And again, I feel like everyone I work with, the idea is help people to feel more comfortable being themselves, have a more sense of security just being themselves. And this relates to all the perfectionistic tendencies people we work with have. They feel like they got to fit in by being perfect, by doing everything the best, never admitting they don't know something, never admitting they can't do something, always like just completely, sabotaging their well-being because they're pushing themselves too hard, right? It's a perfect example of like, let's help you to just be more genuine and authentic. People trying to impress other people, trying to get attention, people trying to, prove that they can, get someone's attention, right, for the wrong reasons. For me, this is why it's across all therapies. A lot of therapy is about being more authentic to yourself and trusting that that's enough. And I'm not suggesting that you just tell people, go do that. A lot of therapy is exploring a person, helping them to explore themselves, understand how these patterns developed in the first place, helping people feel comfortable opening up just by your presence. I try to help people to just feel comfortable opening up, as you said before. Just want people to feel comfortable, and the answers will come. The answers will come naturally between the conversation we have.
So a lot of times when I'm working with educators and parents alike, I remind them that the students and their children, they often look at adults and just see all that they do.
Yeah.
And it happens with me too, right? I've said this before on the podcast and I say this all the time. As an educator, I make mistakes on purpose and I emphasize them, right? To show that we're all vulnerable and we can all make mistakes. And when I don't know something, I name that, right? And I didn't always do this, but it's so important to, pull the curtain back and let especially young people, again, who haven't had the exposure and experiences failing and getting back up again or trying something new and being okay with like, oh, that just wasn't for me. I'm glad I tried it though. Now I know. Right? This is something that often stifles a lot of development, stifles a lot of people's experiences and exposures to things. And, you know, it could be difficult to acknowledge and realize. It could be difficult as an adult in the life of a young person or a coach in the life of an athlete to pull it back and be like, you know, this happened to me before. I can tell you a story. You might be able to hear that it's something I experienced, but we don't really own and accept it until we've experienced it ourselves. So it makes it difficult sometimes. And it often makes us as adults in the lives of young people actually be really vulnerable and do an exposure for ourselves to admitting that we've done something wrong. And it's not just about like saying, hey, you know, failure is okay. Because I hear that a lot in schools. And I love that we're talking more about making mistakes.
Right.
But we need to actually model that and model the resilience piece of it. Because there's this really nice body of work, I'll cite it in the show notes, that people in more performance psychology are really talking about the difference between perseverance and resilience.
I like that.
And this idea of like perseverance, like you just keep going, right? And sometimes that actually can be harmful. And I see this a lot in our perfectionistic characteristics that show up for a lot of people. That you just keep going and going and going. And, you know, everybody says it's great to have grit and persistence. Motivation is a wonderful thing, but at what expense?
Yeah.
Right? At what point do we go too far and do too much because we think we have to? Versus resilience, which I like to emphasize a lot in saying, I don't care about what happened as much as I care about what we learn from it and how we repair or move forward from it. And, you know, this is not to say persistence isn't bad. It's just to like be aware of what we're doing and how we're doing things. So I'm gonna be the patient for a moment, right? You know, I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna say, you know, hey doc, listen, I'm going skiing this weekend. We're going to a mountain I've never been to. There's going to be a lot of expert skiers just on the mountain because people who live around there really love to ski. You know, all the Mainers, they're up there skiing every day, which would be amazing. But I haven't skied in a long time. I maybe ski once or twice a year. And I know I've got some skills. I've skied harder trails before, but the people I'm going with are exceptional skiers. They ski all the time. They have no fear, even the kids.
That's true.
Right? And last time I was with them, we did some hard trails, but I was pretty scared. And I knew I probably shouldn't have pushed myself, even though I got through it. You know, what advice would you give me to getting on the mountain and paving my own path as I'm planning for that weekend?
Yeah. Well, let me ask you the first question. What is it like to see those other people doing those amazing things on the slopes?
It makes me feel good that they find such joy in their skills and in doing what they are doing to be able to ski that way. But I will say, when I'm amidst them, when I'm like in like the experience, like I get nervous when they come down so fast and they're so skillful. And then it makes me like feel less confident in my own skills.
So part of you feels like it's really amazing. What a great, joyful experience they're having. Sounds like you wish you can have that with them.
Totally.
And then another part of you also feels like, well, it's a little nerve-wracking because you're not them. They have a lot of confidence, but you don't have that confidence quite yet.
Yeah, my prefrontal cortex is way too developed to be able to be so uninhibited that I'm like, I'm just going to go for it.
Definitely.
Well, in layman's terms, you know, like, yeah, like I wish I could just go out there and not be nervous about messing up.
Yeah, I can.
Because messing up might mean I could like break a bone or have a concussion or hit a tree. Like there's so many things that can happen.
Okay. Tell me how it, and this is like I'm narrating my thought process as a therapist. So at this point, side note, at this point, what I'm trying to do is
thought bubble.
At this point, I'm trying to help the person to explore and sit with, as you said, sit with those emotions of missing out. And because a lot of times people act impulsively or do things against their values or what they really want because they just react to their feelings immediately rather than sitting with those uncomfortable feelings, because that's, part of exposure therapy is just sitting with your emotions, because if you don't, you're not truly exploring yourself. You're not truly thinking critically. You're just reacting. So, okay, cut. So
thought bubble popped.
So tell me about what it feels like to see them doing those amazing things, having that community, really enjoying themselves. Tell me like what that feels like for you to miss out on that.
Part of me gets kind of angry that like we didn't do more of this when we were younger, to do these kinds of activities and sports. And some of like my feeling is like kind of anger that like we didn't have the opportunity to grow up doing this every weekend, because mom did when she was younger. And I'm like so happy that she had that experience, because I have had that joy before where I just, was an open trail and I was able to, ski a harder trail, and it felt great when I was able to do it when I was a little bit younger and I did it more often. So there's a little bit of anger that like, I wish I could have done this more. And then there's also like the like I said before, this joy. Like I love seeing people, especially people I care about, enjoying something they love to do. Right? So there's like this conflict of like, okay, I recognize I'm realistic about where my skills are, because I know I haven't had so many experiences leading up to this moment. But then there's also this like idea of like, I can compensate, I can do this. So why don't I just try it so I can be a part of it with everybody else? And maybe some of their joy will spill over to me, even if I'm nervous.
So I'm going to cut for a second, thought bubble of the therapist. I'm going to keep trying to fulfill the context of why this is so important, why these emotions are coming up. I think a lot of times when we talk to someone about their emotions, we try to solve the problem or try to just act as if, okay, they feel this way and that's it. So part of therapy is giving a larger context around where these emotions come from. So I'm going to try to contextualize the emotions more, because that's validating, right? We don't want to just say, oh, you feel bad, get over it. We want to try to validate why it makes sense. This comes from dialectical behavior therapy. This comes from a lot of therapies, right? And parenting practices is try to validate why it makes sense the person feels the way they feel. Because if you're going to dismiss their emotions or just say, get over it, right? That's not going to help them to process their emotions. And in fact, as you said before, resiliency, in my mind, is actually just processing your emotions. And it's not enough sometimes to say, just get over it, just keep pushing through, persistence, because you're not truly processing how you feel. And sometimes we have to get through those emotions. We got to understand them more deeply, to have insight, to recognize them, to let them out, to have catharsis, to feel like someone understands us, right? That's resiliency. And that's a misstep in terms of parenting, coaching, teaching. It doesn't mean that you have to do an incredibly long, drawn-out process to validate someone's emotions. You also don't, it's not that you have to validate things that don't necessarily need to be validated, right? But there is a process in therapy helping people to work through their emotions. Okay, so back to the scene. So I imagine that in the context of the winter time, right? The winter, there's not too much going on. It must have felt like, I'm imagining, you can tell me this is right or wrong, that you were really looking forward to the ski trip because there's not too much activity happening, in Boston in the winter time. And it's like, wow, this could be so much fun. I'm imagining that really intensified maybe how you felt even more about wanting to be there, doing the harder trails.
Yeah, it was something we were looking forward to for a while, right? Like I love being able to come together and just be with people you care about, have some fun, and to do it through a winter activity and a winter sport, it's pretty cool. And, I think, I never really named this, but I think maybe, imagining how, mom used to go on ski trips too when she was younger with all of her friends kind of comes to mind. And I'm like, oh, that's so cool. I wish we had those experiences, because she had such a great time and it was like so formative for her as a person, not just as a skier, which is pretty cool. So I think maybe all of that kind of came into play.
Absolutely. See, if I didn't bring up that question, you would have never gotten to that insight right there, right?
Thought bubble.
So okay, we're contextualizing, we're trying to validate, we're trying to understand why these emotions are valid, they make sense, they're coming from somewhere, right? That's really important in therapy, right?
I would say it's also important in like teaching and learning and parenting and coaching.
Yeah.
Even in like relationships with partners or friends So important.
100%. And why is, back to the purpose of this episode, Thought Bubble, this is exposure therapy because we're trying to just sit with these emotions that we react to so quickly. You know, the therapy that David Barlow developed, he says that there's emotion-driven behaviors. We have an emotion and we react to them really quickly. And part of the therapy is to help you to just sit with the emotions rather than react to them too quickly, because the emotions drive us to do things that we may not feel as helpful, adaptive, beneficial in the long run. So for instance, like if you just went skiing those hard trails because your emotions were like, oh, I'm angry or I'm excited, I'm going to go do it, right? If you just,
or my adrenaline takes over because I'm just ready to go. I'm like, yeah, let's go.
Exactly. In the short term, so this is the way the model works. In the short term, that emotion-driven behavior to go on that black diamond would have felt good in the short term. Like, oh, I'm with the people, we're having fun, right? This is exciting, right? All the things you want to get out of it. But in the long term, what we find is with these emotion-driven behaviors, sometimes it's actually not beneficial, right? Let's say you just white-knuckled it the whole time, you almost got hurt, like it wasn't actually enjoyable. Whereas if you just sat with those emotions and said, okay, I'm angry, I'm upset, I'm missing out, but let me just accept it and just kind of sit with it and do what's important to me, which is get a lesson, build up my confidence, and kind of redirect your energy towards something that's meaningful to you. That would be sitting with your emotions and kind of redirecting your decision making.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, back to my fake therapy session. Where were we?
Okay, so
you made the connection to why it makes sense that I might be upset or worried or second guessing myself about just going for it.
Totally, right. And at this point, you can make your own decision, right? Let's put you back in that state. So let's put you back into that situation. You can decide whether you want to go on the hard or black diamond, or you can just get a lesson. Based on what you know about, emotion-driven behaviors, based on what you know about what's important to you, what you value, how would you go about making a decision if you were to kind of go back in time?
So I actually, in this experience, I was thinking through what skills I needed, where I think I can improve, and what I could do next.
Yep.
And, for probably 2 months leading up to this trip, I was like, okay, how can I get into better physical shape so I can protect my body when I get on the slopes? And unfortunately, I got sick for like a month where I really couldn't do as much as I wanted to.
Good point.
And I kind of had to have a reality check, right? In thinking about, is this actually physically something I'm ready to do, is take on the harder slopes if I'm not feeling as strong as I normally do. And it's interesting because when I did end up taking my lesson, sorry, I'm kind of going back and forth here, even though I'm supposed to be pre-ski trip in this therapy session.
That's good.
But when I was taking my lesson, my instructor actually reminded me, and it was something I kept like saying in my head over and over again. She's like, your core has to be strong and your stance needs to be strong. And she gave me some pointers because, and for any women who are skiers out there who are listening, there's different physiological, attributes of a woman's body that we need to consider when we're, setting up our stance for skiing. And I'm sure this is true across a lot of sports. I'm just not an expert in it. But what this instructor reminded me is that like we need to actually balance our bodies and set up a little bit differently than when we were younger and than adult males might do. So she kept reminding me like, be strong in your core and your stance. So as I was skiing after the lesson and even during the lesson, I kept reminding myself like, oh, strong, strong, strong. And I wasn't feeling strong going into this trip. So that was, I think, making me nervous about taking on the bigger hills and the greater challenges, even though like my heart was like, yeah, I got to be with everybody. This is awesome. We don't have this opportunity very often.
Yeah.
So it was like going back and forth between those two ideas.
Great. So this is a good example. So you made the exposure smaller. So in exposure therapy, we try to say
Thought bubble.
In exposure therapy, we try to not like you don't have to do the hardest thing. But it can still be an exposure, right? Because you were still skiing, and skiing is still something you're trying to build your confidence in. So it wasn't like that was easy, the lesson, right? The lesson was still kind of challenging, wasn't it? So that, that's something that you can embrace, that the person can embrace. This is still a thought bubble, right? You can help the people to embrace that they take a really big challenge and they break it down into smaller steps, right? As exposure, right? If someone wants to make a friend, you're not going to be like, go make a friend, right? You're going to say, what are the smaller steps to doing something you're afraid of doing to build up to it? The other thing I will say is that...
Are we back to the therapy or thought bubble?
Let's do another part of the therapy. So I would also say, Lex, that another exposure that you did in this situation was have to tell somebody else that you're not going to do it, right? I think a lot of people have a hard time feeling like you're disappointing someone, or not being part of something, or confronting something they don't want to say to someone, right? Or it's embarrassing. People can feel embarrassed, like, oh, I'm not as good as you, whatever. Most people feel that way, right? So what was that like to be able to say to the other people, hey, like, I'm not going to be able to go with you guys, right? Which in of itself is an exposure, isn't it?
Yeah, it was tricky. It was really tricky, especially because, even the little ones were like, yeah, you could do this, right?
That's right.
Because, I've skied with everybody before. I could, quote unquote, do it, right? But there's tons of compensation going on when I'm doing it.
Yeah.
So it was hard, right? But it also felt empowering, in a way that I was choosing myself and what I needed, instead of just going with the flow, which I'm really good at going with the flow, especially in social situations. But for this, it was really difficult for me to say, no, I think I'm just going to stick to the greens and blues. This is what I need today. Maybe I'll be able to readjust and revisit this another time.
Yeah.
And hopefully we quote unquote, it's hard to get everybody together to do stuff like this, and it's expensive and all of that.
Yeah.
But in my mind, I was like, okay, this is actually going to build my foundation, right? I tried to go, and I say this to my clients all the time, I try to do what I coach other people to do.
Yeah.
Right? I can't just tell somebody, oh, yeah, this is what would be helpful, unless I experience it myself. And this is a really good example of how I was thinking, okay, how do I build my foundation so I feel stronger to take on greater challenges next?
Yeah. And so acceptance and commitment therapy was that you pursued your values.
Yeah.
You did something that was meaningful to you despite feeling afraid of maybe missing out, being embarrassed or whatever, right? So I think it's amazing, right? And you kind of take pride in that.
It actually led me to share on social media, which I don't always do. I shared that I took a beginner's mindset, and that actually felt that even like solidified my choice even more, because I was like, you know what? I could share this with, a lot of my clients follow me on social media with getting little doses of Alexis. And I felt really empowered to share that. And accepting that it's okay to be a beginner, even though I'm not a beginner.
Yeah.
Because every day is a new day. This year was a different year. The ski season was a different ski season than it was before.
Yeah.
And, like we talk about all the time on the podcast, sometimes we need to remember that just because we did it before, just because, people are cheering you on, doesn't mean it's right for you all the time.
Absolutely. So at the end of the session, I would ask, your worst case scenario kind of did happen, right? Because you didn't want to miss out on, right? You wanted to be part of the group. You wanted to be able to do the harder trail, right? So in some ways, your fear was missing out. And exposure therapy suggests, well, even if that does happen, was it still okay? Did you find a way to cope? Did you find a way to have comfort? Did you find meaning in the experience despite that happening? So I'll leave that question to you. Do you feel like even though the worst case scenario happened, obviously there's other worst case scenarios that could have happened.
Yeah, thank goodness.
But everybody's fear is...
For the listeners, I did not get injured.
Right. And this, that's because you didn't have that emotion-driven behavior to try something that was beyond limits.
Well, I think another part of the fear was that I didn't want to just play it safe either. Like I didn't want to just, especially because I don't go to ski mountains that often, I didn't want to be there and just stick to what was comfortable. I wanted to push myself, but I also was like realistic about how I pushed myself.
Right.
So yeah, the greatest fear of quote unquote missing out sort of happened. But I also, one of our friends joined me on one of the runs and was like, I'll take it slow. And then reinforced the work that I was doing to build my skills and was like, oh, you got some skills. You're pretty good. You could probably do these better trails. And I'm like, yeah, next year. And that's okay.
And the trip as a whole still worked. The big picture.
The big picture was great. It was so much fun.
Time.
It was so nice. But I will also say, just as like a quick funny aside, is, my fears were realized our very first run when we first got to the mountain, because we went up, the bunny hill probably. Just to get on the mountain, and there was like a ski lesson group with little kids, and I rode up the lift with like a 4-year-old,
just ripping it,
who was like, yeah, she was like so chatty. It was so cute. She's like, yeah, I've been skiing for like 2 years. She's like, yeah, I do this and I do that. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're really good. So that it was a little bit of an ego hit for a minute, because I was like nervous. Like, okay, am I really doing this? Even waiting for the ski lesson and the instructor to join me, I was a little nervous. Like, it took a little ego hit to say like, hey, pretend I know nothing about skiing. Like that was also a huge exposure for me personally. That was really hard for me to do.
Yeah. Thank you for the session.
Thank you.
This is a really nice example. And I think it shows what the point of this episode is about, is exposure therapy is not just, like, we can take another person, like even myself, right? For me, the exposure of that trip was to do the Black Diamond, right? Because we don't ski that much anymore. We wish we could. And I had a trust that I can do it, right? Because of like my abilities is a bit higher, right? But I still had some fear.
You're a good skier. We'll give you that. You always have been. You and Mom would rip the Black Diamonds and I would watch, and that's okay.
And but it just kind of shows that different people have different types of fears to overcome, right?
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter, right? That doesn't make me a better person than you at all. It doesn't mean anything is better about me. We're just different, right? Because we have different experiences and different fears for us to overcome.
This is such a great example, because sometimes in a group, and I see this in the classroom all the time, one person being fearful of something can look completely different than somebody else in the same context, right? Like your fears, your worries might look a little bit different, might be focus on something different. Like you and I were both skiing with the same group of people, and I was afraid of one thing. You had a little bit of fear of another thing.
Yeah.
And mine was maybe more apparent because I was trying to talk myself through it and coach myself through it out loud. You didn't really talk about being worried about skiing with, the crew and being on the harder trails, even though, as you say now, that was part of your experience. So I think this is actually a really important thing for the listeners to hear and to understand too, is that we may all present and look on the outside a little bit different. It doesn't mean we're not internalizing the experience in similar ways.
100%. So let me give an example of that. And I've been talking, I work with a lot of college students. There's like colleges on every block in Boston.
Yeah.
A lot of times I'll ask the college students who maybe have an issue with substances or anxiety and stuff, right? And it seems like at a party, everybody is just like having fun. People who are just like the life of the party, like they're the most confident people. They have no anxiety. They have no insecurities, right? And the truth is, whether I'm working with that person or someone else who's watching that person, the reality is that everyone's insecure, right? Everybody has their insecurities. They just play out differently.
But I'm gonna tweak the context a little bit. I think everybody has an insecurity, especially when you're in a new environment.
Yeah.
Right? When you're doing something that's not exactly the same as you do all the time. Like maybe there's different people, maybe it's a different type of party, maybe it's, I don't know, all of that.
Absolutely, right. So let's take, maybe a more introverted person who's looking at someone who's the life of the party, who's drinking a lot, who's like making everyone laugh, right? And I'll ask, do you think that person has some anxieties? They look like they're confident, having fun. And through exploration, we kind of get to the point of saying, well, maybe what they're doing to be, the clown or trying to get everybody to laugh, maybe that is actually their insecurity coming out. You just don't realize it because it seems maybe a little extreme, right? Do you really have to be that over the top to, what are they trying to do by doing that? By drinking
What's
excessively?
the function of the behavior?
What's the function? Right, exactly. Because everybody's celebrating them and giving them attention. Like, oh, they're so funny. They're so great. And believe me, I work with people who go through this. Deep down inside, they're like, well, that was exhausting because I'm trying to get everybody to like me. And I'm feeling like this is the only way people will appreciate me is being like, the party animal, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then deep down inside, they're like, oh, well, they actually feel insecure. They feel like, oh, they're not smart enough. They're not this enough, that enough. That's the only way they can feel good about themselves, right? And everybody has their own version of this, right? Even the smart person in class could over-identify with being the quote-unquote smart person and always try to prove that they're the smartest as a way to deal with their insecurities.
And well, that actually perseverates perfectionism too.
100%.
Right. I have this identity. I need to live up to it all the time.
Exactly. Athletes do the same thing, right? So what I'm suggesting here is exposure therapy is important in any type of therapy or just in terms of life, because if we can be honest with ourselves, we can say, oh, that's actually an emotion-driven behavior, like trying so hard to deal with my insecurities in ways that I'm not realizing I'm actually doing that because I'm feeling insecure. I'm not doing that because I care about it. I'm not working hard because I find it meaningful or interesting or because this is a meaningful goal for me. I'm not trying to make someone laugh because it's a pleasant experience because I value our relationship. I'm actually just trying to get them to like me.
Sometimes.
Right. And it all depends, right? It's not an either or thing. See,
right.
But the point is to try to learn what is your authentic self and how can you at least bring that to balance a little bit more, to be more authentic and not have these constant, which is exposure therapy, right? To be authentic is exposure because
totally.
It's scary for people to be, am I enough? Can I just be?
Yeah.
Is that enough? And that's a whole process to feel like you are enough to just be yourself rather than try so hard all the time.
And we're going to talk more about this as the season unfolds. But, one of my little Alexisisms is, our behavior flows where our attention goes.
Yeah, I like that.
So if we're constantly focusing on the behaviors that we're worried about playing out in our lives, oftentimes we're going to focus more on that, and that's going to happen more often. So there's the idea of like a self-fulfilling prophecy that like the more you think of something, the more it's going to happen. But remember, from a neurobiological standpoint, like the more you think about something, the more you're strengthening that neural connection. Like you're giving it more power, literally, that it's reinforcing that this is true. Like our brains aren't actually intelligent enough to decipher between what's true and what's not.
Yeah.
So if we tell ourselves the things that might happen, we're going to believe that is true. Versus really, like you're saying, like going through the process of seeing what's possible. And through baby steps of exposure, that helps us to get to whatever goal we're working towards achieving.
Yeah. And you learn so much, right? I mean, you learn through experience. You learn the nuance of things. You learn how to like understand things better, right? Like the person I said, let's bring it back to the beginning. The person who's afraid of going on the bus. They start to realize, oh, like this is what real danger looks like. This is what non-danger looks like, right? As opposed to thinking everything's dangerous, right? And you don't really, so it's not to suggest that there's not going to be danger on a bus sometimes. Maybe, depending on where you live or where you are, that's possible, right? But the point of exposure is to begin to consolidate the knowledge, the wisdom of the experience. Say, oh, okay, now I have a better idea what this looks like. It's also good to talk to people too. Even exposure therapy is like, hey, go talk to someone who's been through what you've been through so that you can learn from them and kind of consolidate that information, their wisdom into your own wisdom. The nuances of life, how to navigate life.
Yeah. So as we're closing up this episode, some people may take the exposure to start therapy, but some people might just want to try these baby steps on their own and see if they can kind of step outside of their comfort zone, right? The lowercase f, the lowercase fear that they might want to approach and broach. And as we're talking, I'm hearing examples that our shared clients have shared with me in the past. I was thinking about one, who pretends they're like in a movie and they're playing out how it might go in different scenarios. So can we leave our listeners with a few tips that they can think about? How can they do potentially like some mini exposures? Of course, we're not talking about big fearful things because in my work especially, there's always this sense of like something could go wrong, like you were saying before. but it can also potentially go right.
Yeah.
And, we want to help people feel comfortable taking on challenges that there might not always feel like they have complete control over.
Mm-hmm.
So I take on the sports psychology phrase of controlling the controllables. We've talked about that a lot here on the podcast.
Yeah.
So we can control the controllables and we can anticipate that things won't go well. But how do we help people that are out there listening, take on some of those challenges, kind of step outside of their comfort zone and try some of what we've been talking about here today on their own?
I think I'll give one suggestion, is just talk about it, but talk about it openly. And that could be the hardest thing because you're not sure how people are going to respond, right? When you bring up something you're afraid that people are going to dismiss it or just tell you to get over it or not really hear you out. So if you're going to bring up your fear to someone, start by saying, hey, before I tell you this, whether it's your therapist or your friend, family, someone you trust though, say, hey, I'm going to bring this up. I haven't really talked to anybody about this. And when I say, I feel, just say how you feel. Say like, I'm hesitant to bring this up because I'm afraid of how you're going to react. And when people say that to me in therapy, I'm like, wow, this is amazing. They're beginning to feel like they can be honest. And being honest is so important. And say, hey, just talk about it. And say, hey, if I bring this up, can you just hear me out and we can just explore it rather than feel like we have to fix it? Mm-hmm. Because when you're afraid of something, you're afraid people are going to get you to do the thing you're afraid of. And again, as a therapist, I'm not immediately like, well, you better get over that. Mm-hmm. You better start doing it, right? Mm-hmm. I'm more just like, hey, let's begin the process of exploring it, understanding it. And that helps people feel safe. Feeling a sense of safety and security is essential for therapy. And it's essential, it's really important for any relationship, as you said. So, whether you're helping someone or you're the person being helped, create that as the context that you just want to feel safe enough to just explore it. And that you're also willing to be open to hearing what other people say, and that you're willing to consider the fact that, maybe there's a different perspective to take on this. Don't feel like you have to dig your heels in and say like, I'm not going to listen to anybody else. Just say, I just want to explore this. It doesn't mean I have to change anything. It doesn't mean I have to make a decision. That's the foundation. Just talking about it. Don't feel like you're being trapped the moment you say something. Don't feel like, oh man, I said this, now I feel trapped. Yeah.
And going back to what you started with, that there's so many different therapies and there's things that we can pull from different ones that make sense in a moment. I love what you said about feeling authentically yourself, right? Accepting that this is who I am and being vulnerable enough to share that in a safe space. But also what I like to pull from is in DBT, there's this idea of you can ask for what you need, right? Sometimes you could just say hey, I just need to say this out loud. Can you just listen?
Yeah.
I would really appreciate you validating what I'm experiencing. Or, hey, can you help me to problem solve this? Because a lot of times people who are well-intentioned and really care about others are going to try to constantly problem solve in every situation. And sometimes, just for the listeners, that can sometimes shut people down who are tiptoeing into this space of should I try something new? Should I step outside my comfort zone? And sometimes when we jump in and we try to problem solve for them, and we all have this tendency, the best of intentioned people, I have to, put my foot on the brake a lot of times, both in personal and professional situations. And I'm not always the best at it in personal situations. I'm working on it, friends and family. Because I don't have the answers and I don't live everybody else's experience. And we need to be honest about that. Everybody's experience is different. And even from moment to moment, what we are available to might shift and change. And that's okay. But, from a person who's, like you're saying, trying to step outside their comfort zone and try this on and see if it works for them. Of course, working with an experienced therapist that you trust and feel comfortable with is always the best option. But if that's not available, just start by creating these safe spaces and asking for what you need and see how potentially you find some clarity in just saying things out loud, right? Instead of holding on to everything in your own mind and only replaying these ideas of what maybe the worst case scenario might be. Because there's a chance that might happen, but there's a chance it might not. And I think that's what this whole point of everything is that to truly make change in our lives, sometimes we need exposures to the things that scare us the most.
Yep. And even just talking about it is exposure.
Yeah. So I really appreciate the conversation. And Jerry, I know there's so much that you've been thinking so deeply about that I know are going to come out more and more in some of these episodes in the next, for season 6 and onward. So I really appreciate your thoughtfulness, your respect for the people you work with and for the field and for the researchers and mentors that you've had, but also for the greater field and how it all influences how we navigate the complexities in life and how we support each other to get through it all.
Yeah. Thank you, Lex, for being the impetus to this podcast.
That was an exposure for you, for sure.
Sure was.
Thank you, Jerry. And we're excited for season 6. Let's go. Thank you for being here, all of our listeners, and spreading the message of the podcast. Again, we're not here to tell you what to do. We're here to share some information, some expertise, some anecdotes, some experiences that hopefully you can pull from, and it helps you in your journey.
Thanks for tuning in to the ReidConnect-Ed podcast. Please remember that this is a podcast intended to educate and share ideas, but it is not a substitute for professional care that may be beneficial to you at different points of your life. If you are in need of support, please contact your primary care physician, local hospital, educational institution, or support staff at your place of employment to seek out referrals for what may be most helpful for you. Ideas shared here have been shaped by many years of training, incredible mentors, research, theory, evidence-based practices, and our work with individuals over the years, but is not intended to represent opinions of those we work with or who we are affiliated with. The ReidConnect-Ed podcast is hosted by siblings Alexis Reid and Dr. Gerald Reid. Original music is written and recorded by Gerald Reid. Editing and recording was done by Cybersound Studios. If you want to follow along on this journey with us, the ReidConnect-Ed podcast will be releasing new episodes every 2 weeks each season. So please subscribe for updates and notifications. Feel free to also follow us on Instagram at ReidConnect-Ed podcast. That's ReidConnect-Ed podcast, and Twitter at ReidConnect-Ed. We are grateful for you joining us and look forward to future episodes. In the meanwhile, be curious, be open, and be well.